Hello, everyone. We are so happy to be back with you for another edition of our Outlander Buzz. We're back here with another episode focusing on North Carolina's history, and we have a special guest that Beth is going to introduce to you.
Yes, I am. I'm so excited once again, to introduce Professor William S. Bill Caudle. Let me just tell you that Bill has a resume that is unlike anything I've ever seen. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Bill, but there's so much more to the things that Bill can do, the things that Bill knows, and we're just so excited to have him on our Outlander Buzz video tonight. Bill is a native of Waxhaw, North Carolina. He is descended from both Highland Scots and Ulster Scots families who settled in the Carolina Sandhills and Piedmont regions, respectively. He was an avid history buff from a very young age, and this, combined with an interest in music, led him to take up the Scottish bagpipe at the age of 9, which he has pursued to great success in becoming one of the few Southern-born players of the 20th century to reach the professional level of playing and competition. He graduated from St. Andrew's Presbyterian College with a BA degree with honors in history in 1989. His undergraduate honors thesis dealt with the historical use of Scottish Gaelic in the Highland settlement of the Carolinas. He also completed graduate studies in folklore at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, go Hills, receiving the MA degree in folklore and history in American Studies. His MA thesis dealt with the history and associated oral traditions relative to the last Highland immigration to North Carolina, which occurred in Scotland, Robeson, Richmond, and Moore counties in 1884, and involved research and oral history fieldwork both in North Carolina and Skye in Scotland. He has given lectures and other presentations for countless historical and genealogical societies throughout the Carolinas, and has also presented lectures on the history of Scottish settlements in the Carolinas and the cultural retentions of Highland Scots in the Carolinas at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, the North Carolina Museum of History in Raleigh, as well as at a symposium on Scottish Gaelic culture in North America, sponsored by Harvard University. Bill is the founder of the Scottish Heritage Center and the pipe band at St. Andrew's University, formerly St. Andrew's Presbyterian College, where he was hired after graduation in 1989 to launch that program. Since that time, the Scottish Heritage Center has become a clearinghouse of information for those researching the experience of the Scots in the Carolinas. The center was relocated into its own freestanding 6,000 square foot facility in March of 2009. Bill is also the founder of the Scotland County Highland Games, which began in 2009, and have since grown to become the largest single tourist draw of attraction to Scotland County annually since that time. Through his leadership and the support and assistance of dozens of volunteers from Scotland County and the surrounding region, this event has grown to become one of the most popular Scottish events offered in the southeastern United States, yet retaining the charm and authenticity of Highland gatherings held in small communities in Scotland. Bill, I would like to welcome you to this edition of Outlander Buzz Part 2 that we are going to be talking about tonight.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. So we're going to go ahead and jump into our questions here. The first one that we have for you is, what religious denomination were most of the Scots immigrants to North Carolina?
Well, the greatest majority of the Highland Scots immigrants were certainly Presbyterian. The Presbyterian Church had obviously gained a foothold, certainly in places where a lot of the immigrants to North Carolina came from, particularly the county of Argyll. The Duke of Edinburgh being one of the top Crown supporters, and post-Reformation time here, most everyone is Presbyterian from the areas that came here to North Carolina. Interestingly enough, though, the Baptist faith was starting to gain in certain places in Scotland during the time of immigration, in the same time as sort of the great revival movements here in the United States, particularly here in the Southeast. So, for example, one of the early Baptist ministers, sort of the father of the Baptist faith in the Upper Cape Fear and Upper PD region here, is a man called Daniel White, who was a converted Baptist, immigrated here as a Baptist, and founded Gallic-speaking Baptist congregations in Robinson and Scotland counties in the early years of the 19th century. So primarily Presbyterian, but maybe with some other flavors sprinkled in there as well.
It's interesting because, I thought from watching Outlander that most of the Highlanders were Catholic, but that's not really the case.
Not really the case. There were Catholic leanings there. The support for Charles, that was mainly a political thing. The Church of Scotland had made great inroads into establishing, the Presbyterian Church as the church of the state. And so by the time of immigration here, most of these people were coming out of Presbyterian congregations in the areas from which they came to the Carolinas.
Okay. The next question we have is from one of our group members, Bill, and she is asking what churches in the area held Gaelic services, and she is particularly interested in the Ben Salem community in Moore County, where the Presbyterian Church is. Do you know about that community?
Yeah, know a bit about Ben Salem. The Ben Salem congregation was one of many in this area that first started off as a brush arbor, sort of a place where a minister might visit in some sort of shelter, certainly not a formal edifice like a church, but would come and preach perhaps on a stated schedule. That sort of thing. And we do know that one of the early ministers, a man called Colin Lindsay, who was from the island of Arran, was one of the early people that visited in that community. We know he was a Gallic speaker, and certainly an area there around Ben Salem where there are not only some Argyll folk, I think the names like Monroe, which are very popular in that community, but also a lot of Skye folk as well, a lot of people like McCaskills and McDonald's as well. So yes, that church was one of many within the region. And throughout my own research, I've documented over 30 churches, probably approaching 40 congregations within the old Highland settlement in which Gaelic was spoken, and that's ranging from as far eastward as the congregation, say, down at Black River, the Black River congregation that was founded by Colin Lindsay, a lot of folks from Arran down there. As far west, let's say, is maybe the Mount Carmel Church in Richmond County, which is actually where Flora and Alan MacDonald worshiped. A great Skye minister named John Bethune, who was a loyalist, was the minister there. He was actually chaplain to the loyalist forces. Going north in the Sanford area, you've got the Buffalo congregation, founded around 1797. That was a Gallic speaking congregation. Then moving south, even south of us here in Laurinburg, to some places. The Little PD Presbyterian congregation outside of Dillon, South Carolina, an early 19th century congregation of people, particularly from the island of Lismore, and also some from Appin. So you've got really a pretty large area in which most of these Presbyterian congregations were either served by ministers who were Gallic speakers and could thus serve the Gallic speakers within those communities. They would perhaps have a morning service in English and an afternoon service in Gallic. That tradition continued for many, many years. In fact, there's some evidence that there could have been Gallic services preached as late as the early years of the 20th century. And another interesting footnote to this story is that we know that there were Gallic speaking African Americans as well. You know, a lot of these congregations, the churches that you can go to have the galleries up top where the slave population would have sat for their services. And we know through plenty of primary source accounts that there's a lot of African Americans that were speaking Gallic as well. And one of the interesting footnotes to this is that there's evidence that there was an African American congregation very near the Barbecue Church up near Sanford. It's actually a Reformed congregation. I think now it is an AME Zion congregation, but its roots come from a congregation that was founded by some Gallic speaking former slaves. In fact, there's one of the later ministers to this area, very interesting characters, a father and son, John and James Sinclair, who were pretty ardent abolitionists and actually went north during and following the war, came back south to minister to the former slaves, and both of them being Gallic speakers, ministered to them in Gallic. So could very well be that some of the last services that were held in Gallic may have been preached to African Americans.
That is amazing. So they would have learned that. They would have now Gallic or Gaelic, which is it, Bill?
Oh, you know, Spanish or Espanol. You know, someone speaking about the name of the language would say Gallic.
Okay.
You know, as it's spelled in Scots Gaelic.
Okay.
But yes, you know, prominent numbers of Gallic speakers here, and a lot of records which attest to that.
Well, let me ask you this about slaves that were spoke Gallic. I guess they got that, they learned that from the slave owners. Is that right?
You know, we'll tell you about a couple of accounts that that mention this. There's an account that was recorded in a book called Highland Settler by a fellow called Charles Dunn. He was professor of Celtic Studies at Harvard for many years, and it's one of the first explorations of a Gallic-speaking Highland community in North America. It talks about Nova Scotia, but in that book there's a reference which talks about a woman who landed in Wilmington, that she was so pleased when she came down the gangplank hearing people speak Gallic, and she turned around and she saw this person speaking Gallic, and it was actually an African American.
Wow.
And supposedly the quote was, you know, in Gallic, "Oh my God, are we all going to turn black like that?" That's the account that was given in Dunn's book.
Oh my God.
I have a copy of a newspaper clip from a Raleigh, North Carolina newspaper from 1860.
Wow.
It's an ad for a runaway slave, and it says that the slave will be easily recognized because he can only speak Gallic.
Oh my goodness.
Gallic was an oral language. So let's say, and we know in general that, yes, perhaps there were some affluent families that may have had larger numbers of slaves than others. But say your average Angus Mac so-and-so that's living in the Carolina Sandhills, if he's wealthy enough to have a slave, he probably only has one or two. And let's say those African American folk are, in essence, part of that extended family. Like the stereotypes, and some people will say that, but you're out in the middle of the woods, and you're isolated. Gallic being more of an oral language than a written language, is something that people pick up by ear, as opposed to seeing your books. This is how you speak Gallic. So it certainly was something that was obviously taken into that community. We also have accounts that we have come across of maybe some of the local Native American population, the Lumbee, perhaps being exposed to, and perhaps some mixed or buckskin Scots, or maybe even some Lumbee that would have known Gallic simply because of their interactions with their neighbors.
Wow.
So, Gallic was probably the largest minority language that's ever been spoken in North Carolina until present day.
Wow.
Now, if we think about that, we know that there was a German population, printing, things like that going on with the Moravian settlements up in the northern Piedmont, but this region covered a much larger geographical area. We know that the numbers were certainly quite high once you factor in first and second generation folks that may have had the language as well. There are just numerous accounts of it. There's an account of a British traveler coming through Fayetteville in 1828 that says that the postmaster has to have a clerk in the post office at Fayetteville that's at least knowledgeable in Gallic because of the Gallic speaking population there. So it certainly was something that permeated the whole region. You've got churches, a pretty large number of these churches. Certainly, most any church that's founded before 1820 or so would have more than likely had Gallic as part of their congregations. And then we got African Americans speaking it. We've got some printing in the language as well. So it was pretty undoubtedly the largest minority language until we see now the income of immigrants like the Hispanic immigrants. Thousands of people for whom Spanish is their first language or the language of the home. And that would have been the case. That's the reason Gallic stayed with us for as long as it did. Was it may not have been the language of everyday life and commerce, but it was certainly the language of the home.
It's very interesting. So, Bill, I know that there is this thing going in North Carolina that they're trying to revive the Gallic language. I think University of North Carolina has got some classes that they are hoping to offer, or maybe offering actually. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, actually, an organization on which I serve as a board member called Scottish Heritage USA, headquartered in Pinehurst, formerly from New York City, has been engaging in some efforts to launch a Scots Gallic Studies program at UNC Chapel Hill. And in fact, we did have, for a little over 2 years, a professor that was there that sort of laid some groundwork for that, taught classes. There were over 150 students that were involved in that effort in one way or another. We're now looking at some major fundraising efforts to make an endowed chair a reality there at UNC. It's quite apropos considering the historical links with this state and the language, just as well as our whole multicultural focus. There are other languages. I think every other language that was ever spoken by an immigrant group in North Carolina, even to the point of Cherokee. Cherokee language is taught at UNC. Gallic is not. It should be.
And it should be, absolutely, because our roots are so deep in that North Carolina. So I'm so glad that that's being revived and being taught.
There is interest there. There is not a single institution in the United States where you can go to study Scots Gallic studies. Now, there's places you can do Irish, you can do Polish, you can do everything else, but not a single place that you can do Scots Gaelic studies. Now that's broader, a broader range than just language itself. That's talking about the whole cultural commitment there, storytelling, folkways, foodways, oral history, and the whole Gallic culture, Scots Gaelic culture in general.
Wow.
That would be
That's true. Yeah. Truly amazing.
It's the dream of a number of us, that's for sure.
Yeah. Maybe one day too.
And I mean, the whole Outlander phenomena has really fueled that to a great degree.
It's great.
Because here you're hearing, how many folks had heard Scots Gaelic spoken before outside of seeing it on Outlander? Now it's something that's in the mainstream out there, which is great for the language. It's great for it to expose more and more people to its beauty.
That's right, and we're glad North Carolina's taking the lead on that. So that's great. Like I said, go Heels.
Absolutely.
Carolyn, do you want to ask the next question?
Okay.
I think probably the contribution.
Okay. Sure. So what contribution did the Scottish accent or dialogue make to the Southern accent dialogue?
Well, that's very interesting to say that. There's one wonders. We wish we could have field recordings, of some of these people that did speak Gaelic. I actually do have some field recordings of a couple of the last men. These are men in Harnett County that I had interviewed and recorded back in the late 80s and early 90s. That were descended from some late immigrants from the island of Jura. I say late, their folks came in the late 1830s, early 1840s. And some people may know of this family, the actually pretty famous family in folk circles, the Shaws from the Flat Branch community in Harnett County. They were a family with musical traditions. One of the men was probably one of the last Gaelic speaking precentors in the churches. That is, he lined out the hymns in Gaelic. They had a tradition of string music in the family that was passed on through the generations. In fact, there's still one of the Shaw people, a lady named Evelyn Shaw, he was an old time fiddle player. Interestingly enough, they had some very Highland and very Scottish tunes within the repertory. So yeah, there are these interesting little holdovers. Those two men had some interesting little sayings and bits and pieces that they could still recite. And I know one time back in 1992, I took a cassette recording over to a symposium that I was speaking at in Scotland, and I played this for some scholars. And they said, "My God, that's a Jura dialect." And I said, "Yeah, but listen to the rest of this." And he says, "You want to hear that again?" It's like somebody out of whatever, and their jaws dropped and their eyes got big. "Who is that?" And I said, "That's a man living up in Harnett County, North Carolina, whose people came from the island of Jura." And sure enough, a pure dialect, just as it's passed on. Now, one again wonders what we could have had if we'd had more field recordings, even say as late as the 1920s to the 1950s. What's left behind are probably some words that were left in Southern speak, if you will. We know of terms. We think of just thinking off the top of my head, a cow with no horns. Smooth-headed would be a mull-headed cow. Any man that's raised cattle before is probably going to know that term, a mull-headed cow. A smooth place, a mull is a smooth place. People know the term the brogan shoe. That's something that's really in Southern speak. I'm going to get my pair of brogans and I'm going to go wherever. Well, the word blogan is a pure Gallic word, which simply
Ooh.
means sort of utilitarian shoes. Let's say you're walking along in the woods or in the field someplace and there's something protruding out of the ground. Um, for me, I'd call it a stob, which is a pure Gallic word simply for something like that, something that's sticking out, a stob. Um, you don't hear this one very much these days, but people used to talk about going to the store and bringing something home in a sack. Now, what would you call that sack? Anybody? Yes,
Um,
Carolyn?
it's oh gosh.
On the
Oh
tip of
gosh,
your
I
tongue,
know it. My
maybe?
daddy used a poke.
Absolutely. A poke
poke.
or a poke. It's
Yeah.
a pure Gallic word. It's a pure Gallic word for sack. We can also look at things like small chickens, biddies, just, this Gallic word, bidichin, small things, a biddy. There's any number of these little things that are sort of breeches, brickish, the Gallic word for pants, trousers, beside the word trews, breeches. Another word that comes out of pure Gallic. Now, whether this was a mixture of some Ulster influences and all Highland, we probably can't say it's all Highland because these terms are known throughout the South. But
Right.
but those are certainly words that are pure Gallic words.
Right.
Pure Gallic words. There's other things that people used to do or say. Milking a cow. Some people would say, as they're milking the cow, they'd say saw, 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 as they're milking the cow. There's a great piece of film footage. I think it was done by Alan Lomax, the great folklorist. Someone sang just that as they're milking the cow and singing a little milking song to it. People around here would say the same thing. My dad, we had a small number of cattle when I was growing up, and I used to think it was the funniest thing in the world. My dad would go out and he'd say, "Sook, sook, 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 sook." And
I have heard that. I have
pure
heard
Gallic
that from my own father.
cattle call, a call for cattle, sook, sook, sook. Yeah. So there's so many things here which is sort of been taken for granted. People don't know where they came from. They've just been
Yeah.
using them for years.
Yes.
And
I
some
know.
of them are actually, about to disappear. I mean, when's the last time you heard somebody, "I'm going to put it in a poke," or "a pig in a poke"?
Well, I say that sometimes. I say, that's kind of like buying a pig in a poke.
Yeah,
Because
that's
I've
right.
heard my daddy say that a lot.
Oh,
It's
sure.
kind of like buying something that you've never seen. You
Exactly.
don't know what you're getting.
Exactly. So, a number of those things which do survive.
Yeah. Bridges, brogans, cool.
I know, I love it. I just love it. And we don't even realize that this has been passed down to us from Scotland, actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's all sort of subliminal, as as there's so many things out here. You wouldn't know there's a Scottish connection to it. And I sort of, that's my game. I'm driving someplace and I see something or I hear something or oh, there's a Scottish connection. There always is. There always is a Scottish connection.
Love it. Well, Bill, let me ask you the next question from a group member, and is, did many of the Scots change their name once they arrived here in North Carolina? If they were indentured, did they change their names after they were free? I thought that was a very interesting question.
Yeah, that is an interesting question. Let's maybe address the indenture question first. Now, I would not be the absolute expert on this for early 18th century. However, I think you've got to understand that an indenture is not a slave. There was a great difference between indentures, Caucasian, European indentures, and slaves that grew out of a lot of things that happened in the 17th century in Virginia and other places. So, but So you didn't have that stigma. It's not like somebody's getting a name from the master or whatever. They had their own names. So there wouldn't be any reason for anybody to change that name. That's just my personal take on that. Indentures, we know that people like Flora McDonald and Alan McDonald Kingsborough, they had indentures. We don't see them, everybody becoming McDonald, and they have had their own names. And I think the same is true of anyone that would have had indentures. There wasn't a stigma. It's not you're forced to take the master's name, nothing like that. Certainly not in white indentures. It's interesting that you mentioned changing of names, because a lot of what we see in terms of name changes were probably the fault of the people that are taking records that did not either understand a Scots or a Gallic dialect or brogue, and thus unwritten documents, they go down a bit different from what they may have originally been. An example being, let's take the name Bowie. Very prominent Highland name, comes from the island of Jura, B-U-I-E. All right, there's some 18th century documents in where someone transcribed that into B-U-Y, Bowie. All right, I mean, one might can see that, all right, as to how someone might take that down as such. But then along later, somebody else comes along and that Y looks like a G. B-U-G.
Bug.
Bug. Now, why in the world would somebody be named Bug? Bug. Oh, they must have meant beg. B-E-G-G. So you see how names can get switched and transferred around and things like that. It's simply because of the documentation on this side. And once the literacy rate and gets to the point where these folks can read and write, if they couldn't already, then you find either a correction or a change, or simply they adopt what's on paper. I'm sure a lot of genealogists may have come across that simply by someone trying to transcribe what they hear, and it's simply not being correct. So I think that may address, I don't think you had anyone trying necessarily to change their surnames, unless they had that mythical, or they're trying to get away or escape from a reputation or whatever, something like that, that everybody, seems like about every third person you have a genealogy conversation with, they tell you something like that, Either my people were thrown out of Scotland because they stole horses or stole cattle, or they did this, that, the other, so they changed their name. One of the many, frequent stories and motifs that I hear. But no, I think it was mostly simply by the folks that transcribed the records that happened.
Okay. Well, I just want to throw a little Outlander tidbit in here, Bill, that you may not know, but there's an important character in the Outlander books. Once they come to North Carolina, they are the Bugs, Mr. and Mrs. Bug, B-U-G.
Well, you know what? I wonder if Diana got a hold of this legend, because that's funny, because it's one of the people that was one of the 1739ers that goes down in documents that get listed as B-U-Y, B-U-G. And hey, I wonder if that's how it happened. Yeah,
I know. We need to ask her if she heard about that.
Got a hold of that one tidbit. Absolutely. Well, and now, I guess one other thing to add to that. Let's take perhaps the most pure Gallic speakers coming out of the most pure Gallic areas of Scotland. Let's say someplace in Argyll, someplace in Skye. A lot of these people would have been known by a patronymic not by a surname. They would have been John, son of Donald, son of John, son of, that sort of thing. So we've got a situation in sort of one of the famed characters of the settlement, the famous Gallic poet, Ian Verdicky, John Murdoch's son, who goes down in history books as John McCrae, the great Gallic poet that wrote "Sleep Softly, My Darling Beloved," Jean Caudle and Saul, Cahulan Maroon, the great lullaby to a newborn daughter in America. It ends up that through some very recent scholarship and a new book published by a scholar in Scotland, that the McCrae name is all wrong. He was listed and anglicized as Murdoch's son, Murchison, as opposed to a McCrae. We've got state markers to a John McCrae, who probably never knew that name McCrae, even though he came from McCrae country, but he probably never used that surname. So there's cases like that as well. Donald's son, John, son of Donald, Donald's son. Examples of how those names could have been anglicized, let's say, out of the Gallic. So another little footnote to that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah. Well, just to note, so all of the questions except for the first one that we have asked have been from the group.
Okay.
So to kind of make sure that we put that out there. So the next one that we have, Bill, was there any communication between the Eastern Carolina Scots and those in coastal Georgia, such as the Darian Highlanders?
Yes, very interesting that you mentioned that. The Argyle colony here in North Carolina was planted at roughly the same time that the Argyle patent in upstate New York and the Darian settlement in coastal Georgia was planted between 1738 1740. All of them were independent. There was not a great deal of interchange that we know of between them until the time of the Revolutionary War. And at that point, you've got a very prominent member, second generation of that Darian colony, a Macintosh. Actually, a Macintosh who, in later years, the family intermarried into the Creek Indian Nation, and a lot of colorful history there of Creek and Cherokee connections to the Macintosh clan from Inverness in Scotland. But Alexander Macintosh was a leading patriot in coastal Georgia, and he obviously was a Gallic speaker as well. And we know through the colonial records of North Carolina that there were efforts made by the colonial government to try to get him to visit within this settlement and also to contact its leaders, persuading them to side with the Patriots during the time of the Revolutionary War. Now, we know, of course, that the largest numbers of those immigrants coming in, there were 5 big years. It'd be the years between 1770 and the outbreak of the war, say roughly 1774, spring of 1775. A lot of those people were simply Gallic speakers. The ministers that we had in the area, with one exception, were all relative newcoming ministers as well that sided with the crown. So they're hearing, these folks are hearing from the pulpit. They're hearing pro-government rhetoric as well. There's one notable one, James Campbell, actually the first minister in Gallic, that was actually forced out of the community. He went to Guilford County, then to Mecklenburg County, and sort of forced out by the Tories. But Macintosh was enticed to try to visit and communicate within this region to try to sway that support toward the Patriot cause. Now, I'm not sure whether he actually ever did visit or not, but there were certainly overtures that were made to him on behalf of the colonial government of North Carolina to try to see if he could be of some assistance in communicating with and enticing these folks away from being so ardently loyalist, which we know in the end they simply weren't. But in any event, that's about the biggest connection that I can think of at that point between the Darian settlement and our colony here in North Carolina.
Which brings up another point, another question for me. You know, I used to wonder why it was after Culloden that the Scottish here in North Carolina supported the British. They were a lot of the Scottish, not all, but just like Flora MacDonald, you know, and the Moores Creek, the Battle of Moores Creek. They were so behind the crown after what the crown had done to them at Culloden. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, let's delve into that just a little bit here. First off, let's look at the time period that we've had. We've had almost a generation of time between Culloden and Immigration. So you've got simply the passage of time, you know, that issue. Even though there was in some places, particularly in Upper Argyll, Appin, that area, there was to a degree a lot of internecine sort of almost guerrilla warfare against the government forces in a number of places. You know, still opposition to crown rule, but for the most part, these people had been subdued, and the gradual breakdown of the old Highland culture, the things that have been forced upon them, are what enticed them to leave. But one of the enticements in coming over was the ownership of land. And in order to have that land, to have that grant of land, you had to sign this oath, the oath of allegiance, you know, to the crown, to the colony, and Scots were very conservative people. They took their religion seriously, they took their education seriously, and they took things such as the taking of oaths very seriously. So let's say Angus Mac, whomever, comes over and he signs this piece of paper, I agree to be loyal and share my allegiance. And then in just a few years, he's challenged. Here's this conflict. Oh, well, what do? I sort of think this, but I sort of think this. And I got this community leader, the man that chartered our ship, that is telling us, no, we should support the crown. And then I've got my neighbors over here that are telling me, no, we need to be free. We can do without the taxes and the stamps. And, you know, it's a lot of conflict with these people. You've also got the fact that for the most part, they're hearing a one-sided story. In particular, the community leaders who were the taxman class that led these immigrations over, sure, they may have had their access to grind, but they were simply looking to get ahead. They didn't want to be left in the lurch, homeless and poor, like the people would 2 generations later in Scotland. So they came here to sort of reinvent their own lifestyle. They're big men in the community, if you will. So these are the guys that are wanting to keep their status quo, and so they become the leaders and the people that again are speaking out for the royal cause. So it's almost a one-sided argument that you have in many cases. Certainly that there were not people that were speaking out for the other side as well. There were efforts made. There was even discussion of getting handbills printed in Gallic for the people that could read Gallic and have them distributed within the Highland community. That's on colonial records in North Carolina. But the fact is this. Historians say that based on the newspaper accounts and the other accounts that we have, which give us some ideas, we don't have any exact numbers, no way of finding them because of the loss of records, but give us some ideas as to the numbers of Highland settlers that were here by the coming of the Revolutionary War. Most people would say that it's somewhere between 15 on the low end and maybe 30,000 at the high end. All right, in the Moores Creek campaign, there were roughly 1,600 loyalists that were raised to march down to Cross Creek and march to their defeat at Moore's Creek.
Mhm.
Now, if this community was as adamantly loyal as many people have for years painted them with that wide brush, then you would have had a much larger force turning out, and it would have probably been successful.
Hmm.
1,500 men. There was 100 men that left Cross Creek, a whole company of men from Anson County that just ready to march, off we go, and they turned and ran
Hmm.
and went back home. So 1,500 people, a few deserting here along the way, you know, it doesn't add up to say Scots were all loyal. It just simply doesn't. You know, after the defeat at Moore's Creek, I think a lot of people that may have ridden the fence saw that, hey, this is serious business. We just best either just stay home and be quiet and try to ride this out, or in the other case, we're going to go full out for one side or the other. And we know there are people that certainly did. You have those instances, for example, in the family of the famed Jenny Von McNeil. She purposely enlisted sons on both sides to hedge her bets. And there's probably other families that did that. There were certainly sides, you know, where you had changing loyalties. When things heated up once again here in the South, with the coming of Cornwallis's army, you know, he came through Fayetteville and he was disappointed with the fact that he didn't have this great number of people rushing in to join him. You know, the 71st Township in Cumberland County is named after the 71st Highlanders.
Mhm.
Part of Cornwallis's army that passed through there was certainly involved in recruiting their fellow countrymen. But he lamented that, and it didn't come to fruition. So I think we can really sort of put that argument to the rest, that all these Scots were loyal. It just simply was not the case. Greater numbers that simply rode the fence, tried not to be involved. A lot of them that were accused of such. That's why we have such a large number of people being recorded as leaving what were the boundaries of, at that time, Cumberland County in 1777. You know, there's accounts that say that some people said that there were up to a third of the population was contemplating leaving in 1777, simply because of that loyalty. If you were a suspected loyalist, you might be assessed a tax value 3 times your normal taxes.
Hmm.
You know, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of oppression against these people that were suspected loyalists. It even goes on into the newspapers. There's people that are accused of giving aid to the loyalists as late as the 1790s, early 1800s in some of the newspapers.
Hmm.
So it was an ongoing thing, and you really did not see sort of a finish to that chapter until the time of the War of 1812, in which people found that they had a very large, in some cases, population of resident British aliens that had not taken an oath of allegiance to the United States. And thus you have a lot of these Highland settlers who are saying, oh, well, no, we're loyal to the U.S., so we're going to sign up, we're going to be able to vote and all this. You find a lot of them that are doing that, but then again, there's a lot of these people that die as resident aliens that just simply,
Hmm.
you know,
Hmm.
that's a quote, don't want to rock the boat.
You know, it's kind of sad if you think about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because, you know, you think about what they went through, and you know, I understand more about how much an oath meant to the Scots now that I've read Outlander and researched it more, and you know that they wouldn't have, a lot of them would not have gone back on that oath. But I think we have painted it with a broad brush that all the Scots that were here supported the crown, and they did not. There were a lot that fought at the Battle of Kings Mountain, for instance, that the Campbells were. That's one name that comes to mind.
I'm thinking of James Campbell. Now he would have been an Ulster man. He was, I think, his home was up about Wilkes County. So let's not again.
Yeah.
You know, there's been some suppositions and all. Well, what about the Scots at Kings Mountain? Well, Ulster Scots. I don't think you can say that there was a single
So, Highland.
Highland man there, with except, well, you could actually call him a Highlander, but Patrick Ferguson,
Yeah,
Scott from
he
Aberdeen.
was.
Yeah.
He was.
He was-
Patrick Ferguson really was the real deal. And he
That's
was,
right. And
honestly, he was fighting on the wrong side there, right?
he was shot down wearing a tartan shirt.
Yeah, that's right. We've just had a recent, our last video was with R.G. Absher, who is with the Overmountain Victory Trail Association. And we've been talking about Patrick Ferguson and his Scottish, he was born and raised in Scotland. And, so it's very interesting to play the way it people chose the sides that they did.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, Carolyn, is it your turn or mine?
It's yours.
It's mine? Okay. I feel like I've been talking the whole time. So another question from one of our group members, Bill, is that there are a lot of Scots in Maryland. Did they tend to settle where it reminded them of Scotland?
Well, that's an interesting question. Let me first just answer the question there. There are great numbers of Scots, particularly indentures. And this could have included some Highland folk as well as certainly a lot of lowland folk who were indentures that were brought to the Chesapeake Bay region to work in the tobacco industry. The main connection, the main trade connection in many ways between Scotland and America was the tobacco industry. Between Glasgow and certainly northern parts, but certainly the Chesapeake Bay region. You can go down in Glasgow and you can walk down Virginia Street, just a couple streets back from Suckyall Street, right in Glasgow. There's still reminders there of those important connections between America and Glasgow, which was the hub of the tobacco trade. Glasgow was. So yeah, certainly a lot of people that were sent out as indentures. We do know that there were some of the prisoners sent out as well from the Covenanting Wars, as well as from the earlier Jacobite, the 1688-89, the 1715, and some from the 45 as well, that were sent off to the plantations. Now, that would either mean the West Indies, or in this case, perhaps the Chesapeake Bay region. We didn't get large numbers of those. There's a few accounts of a few Jacobite prisoners from the 15 going into places like Charleston and things like that, but not large numbers. And certainly not here in North Carolina. The governor here was looking to get good, upstanding Protestant folk here. I.e. folks from Argyle, that an area that, as you know from your Outlander history and all, Argyle was an area that was pretty staunchly royalist at that time. The Duke of Argyle being one of the biggest supporters for the government at that time, opposed to the Jacobites. So, but yes, Maryland. You also find the same thing in Virginia as well. All sorts of places where Scots indentures and even some prisoners were taken. Now, you talk about them settling in places that reminded them of home. You look at that and you think, well, for my money, about the only place that might remind them of home would be places like Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia, which to me is a lot more similar to Scotland than the sandhills and pine forests and swamps in North Carolina might be. But in those cases, in Nova Scotia, you had people that were forcibly cleared to a great degree. They're forced away. Our people came voluntarily here to North Carolina. Now, what did they find? They found something about as different from Scotland as you might possibly imagine. When you imagine going up the Cape Fear River, going up the Upper Pee River, encountering swamps and wild animals that they'd never seen before.
Mosquitoes.
Oh, well, now I have to say, anybody that's been in the Highlands of Scotland, the midges have deeper teeth, I think, than mosquitoes
Yeah.
do. They really
Okay.
bite.
Yeah.
Mosquitoes here are sort of an annoyance. Those midges over there will really bite, but but nonetheless, so about as foreign and different, even these days when I have people visiting that come out from Scotland, particularly the Highlands, that have never visited North Carolina before, and they sort of marvel at the contrast in geography and topography. They look at the pine forest and say, "My goodness, this was like a jungle to them," and it truly was. You think about here's people that were used to building with stone and turf, and now they've got to learn how to work in wood. And we don't have enough stone in most of these areas, the sandhills where these people settled. Certainly not to build a house with, as they might have done back on their holdings in Scotland. So I would say there's not really, I mean, sure, there's that longing for home, and gosh, isn't this somewhat like where we settled? Yeah, that would be nice for some people, but the greatest majority of these people never felt that.
Mm.
I mean, you just see people that made what they could and adapted and acclimated themselves to just a completely different landscape.
So North Carolina was pretty much an alien world for them when they got here.
Oh, absolutely. You think about things like snakes. I mean, even in some of the poetry of Ian McVertice, the John McCrae, he mentioned something about we've become Indians, sure enough, with wolves and beasts howling in every lair. I mean, just the sounds and things that you simply don't hear. It would have been very, very foreign to them, and a very scary thing as well.
I bet.
You come across instances. There's actually a famous poem that was written in Nova Scotia, was actually is attributed to dissuading immigrants. It's called the Gloomy Forest, and it talks about all the woods and the trees and all the beasts and this sort of thing, and it has actually made people fearful of immigrating. This is a poem that was, as a 19th century work. In the research that I did in regard to this 1884 immigration, a planned effort to recruit Highland people here that ended up being a dismal failure because of these cultural and other contrasts. One of the accounts that I had orally was that this gentleman's grandmother talked about being so afraid of being in Carolina because of, it was like a forest and a jungle, and the only person that she knew that could speak Gallic beside her husband that lived near them was a minister. So nobody to talk to. You're in this jungle, and she was deathly afraid of African Americans. Never seen one before.
Wow.
So all of those cultural contrasts, were pretty immense for people like this.
Right. And another Outlander tidbit right here is when Claire and Jamie were going up to Cape Fear, they actually saw an alligator. And Jamie was reading, I think it's the Natural History of North Carolina. I can't remember now.
James Brickell.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes. He was reading that. So he was able to tell Claire all about it, and that kind of thing. And also the run-in that Jamie had with the bear. He had a bear later on in that same book. There weren't bears over in Scotland. And I think, is that right, Bill?
Absolutely. Well, we think about the bear population today. Yeah, I mean, there's bear today in Robeson County. We actually had a bear sighting a number of years ago here on our campus in Laurinburg. So think of what it would have been 200 years ago.
Right.
And plus. So yes, all sorts of things like that.
Right. Just a whole different world.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And you can see why that would be scary.
Oh, absolutely. And another thing as well with the contrast, in the Highlands of Scotland, I heard this quote one time from a very good source. I think he's probably right. He says, in Scotland, you're never more than 60 miles from the sea.
Huh.
And when you think about the fact that water and being near water was something that was, a part of the lifestyle of these people, fishing, sailing, not having that, was a big thing for them. You don't go cast your nets for the herring. You go and stick a line in the pond or the river or whatever the case may be, and so yeah, just a huge contrast like that a lot of folks just never really think about.
That's right. And the hardship that they went through having to adapt to that different culture, the natural world, actually.
Even in the case of wood, I was talking with someone one time about this. He said, all right, let's say you lived on the Isle of Skye and you had a holding that might take you down to the seashore. Let's say a piece of driftwood or something, washes up that you could use. Well, you were only a tenant to that land. That is owned by the landlord. So you would have to ask permission to use, to work, to make it into, if you were doing as you should do with all your loyalty. So that sort of restriction and lack of freedom to be able to explore those sorts of things. And here they had it all. God, they had to explore it all.
That's right. That's right. So interesting.
Yeah, it is.
You have to admire them. You really have to really admire them.
Yeah,
here. Yeah, they knew nothing about this land, and they came here and they made it work.
Well, when you think about the North Carolina Highlanders here, and we look at this in retrospect, a good many of the Highlanders that came out in the 19th century, after the time that most of our North Carolina Highlanders were already here, were actually being forced away, forcibly evicted, sent away with no say whatsoever in it. The people that were leading and sponsoring these immigrations which came to North Carolina at least had some choice in the matter. All right, yes, we'll sell our possessions to book our passage, or we'll indenture ourselves because this sounds like a good thing to do. They had some choice in the matter. When you look at places where Scots went otherwise, you can look at places where there were cleared Scots from the islands that were sent along the Canadian prairies to settle along the rail lines of the old Canadian Pacific rail line. You had cleared Scots that were massacred by native populations. You've got folks that are going to Australia. You've got folks going to New Zealand, South Africa, all sorts of places. Our people that came to the Carolinas were really fortunate to have come to the Carolinas as compared to some other places. Now, granted, there's some people that were removed, the Loyalist population that moves away, say to Ontario, the Canadian Maritimes, maybe back home. But the ones that came here under better circumstances as a whole, I would say, than a lot of the cleared Scots that went out to other places in the 19th century. And a lot of people simply just do not know the real tragedies of the clearance, where people either had houses pulled down around them, houses burned out from under them, and just forced away. Away you go. That was not necessarily the case for our North Carolina folk. At least they had there's certainly forces that pushed them, but certainly not an instance like that.
Right.
Which is fortunate for our people.
Yeah, it is. Very much so.
And I think, again, another one of the reasons that this settlement tended to thrive. You got people that had invested themselves. They're not being forced. They've invested themselves into this region and community. They continue to build on it. they out-migrate and take that culture and sense of family bond and roots with them to other places. Our out-migrations here from the Carolinas into the Deep South. By the 1830s and 40s, you've got Gallic-speaking Carolina Scots in Alabama and Mississippi by the 1830s and 40s, taking that with them, and in many cases settling in places similar to what they'd found here. So it's sort of an interesting turn on that question.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Well, I think we only have one more official question, but we'll talk as long as you want to talk.
Okay.
So the last one we have here is there a main registry compiling the names of all Scottish immigrants to North Carolina or elsewhere?
All right, and that's a very deep question, and that's one that a lot of people ask as well. Our list of immigrants to North Carolina are extremely limited.
Mm-hmm.
We are almost confined to parts of the year 1774 and part of the year 1775. That's actually in a publication that appeared in the North Carolina Historical Review in 1934, and was republished by the Department of Cultural Resources. You can buy it as a little pamphlet, little brochure, chapbook booklet, if you will, which lists what remained of the Port of Brunswick record books. Everything else was burned.
Mm.
I have no record of my own immigrant ancestors that came here around 1772, nor to later ones that came in 1802. The records simply just do not exist. There are instances in where there are references to people, i.e., let's say you might have had a newspaper account that might say so-and-so with so many souls arrived at such and such a port, or something on the other side. In some cases, you might get lucky enough to find a contract for chartering a vessel. For example, there's a document that I have about a ship. In fact, it was the only ship that came out in the year 1802, called the Duke of Kent. And someone has found the initial contract between the men that were looking to organize this immigration and the shipmaster. So you've got a few names listed there, so you know what ship they are. Occasional documents like that you might look upon something.
Mm.
But for the most part, that is part of what makes it very, very hard for someone to make that jump from here across the pond. So many ships coming between 1770 and 75, particularly, that, that's why people aren't exactly sure which ship Flora McDonald came on, because there's several. It could have been a possibility of 2 or 3 that sailed out of Campbelltown, which she was on. Records simply don't exist. However, there is a very good scholar by the name of Dr. David Dobson, who's a research fellow at the University of St. Andrews, who has for many years been compiling and publishing lists of immigrants that were found in any number of resources, giving what may be known about them. Came on such and such a ship, first found in tax records or census record, born in Scotland, X, came to America in X year, whatever. He's got a number of volumes. There's one that's particularly devoted to the Carolinas from the late 17th through the early 19th century, simply called Scots in the Carolinas. Is it all inclusive? No, by no means. But I've had a lot of people that have been able to get hits. I'm like, yeah, this is my person. Let's see if they can take me further. In many ways, in this area, one of the better ways that you can perhaps use to determine that is tombstones. it's remarkable that within this region, and I think we talked about this last time about the sense of belonging, belonging to one place and then coming here and still belonging to another place, even though you've passed away and passed on in another place. Tombstones in this community, perhaps more so than any other immigrant group in North Carolina, in many times will tell you that they're either a native of Scotland or what year they immigrated or where they came from in Scotland, which is a tremendous genealogical resource for a lot of people. I think in the last episode, I mentioned one here from Laurinburg that told you almost exactly where they came from, and in a local cemetery. And that information can oftentimes lead you in the right direction. The problem with Scottish records is that you didn't have a lot of church parish data, census data, things like that until the early 19th century. Some places it exists, some places it doesn't exist. So that's the difficulty for a lot of the professional genealogists on that side, is that simply they don't have much to work on or go from. But then again, it's a difficult business. It's really a difficult business. If you're lucky enough to have a ship record, or at least a date that a ship came, I was lucky. Only one ship came in 1802. I happen to have an ancestor on it. My wife had an ancestor on it as well. It's the only ship. So you know what the name of that is, when it came, and there's record for it. But a lot of these people, it just simply is unfortunately not there. We got the 1739ers. We know who they were. But outside of that, the records are very, very scarce. Very scarce.
So the cemeteries, Bill, do the different churches with the cemeteries, or even private cemeteries, are there records for those that people can look to see where, like you were just talking about, where the tombstone?
Yeah.
Are there records that people can look for, and where would they find those?
There's some very good works which have been done on cemeteries within counties. I know that we're working on one in Scotland County right now. Little Scotland County, almost 300 cemeteries or burial sites within Scotland County alone.
Wow.
Now, certainly they're not all Scots, but this concept of the church cemetery is a relatively new one for a lot of these people. And particularly when you think about the fact for these 18th and early 19th century churches, that's only one of a minister's congregations. You had ministers that might serve first and third at one church, then he's got to go in the other direction and serve second and fourth Sundays at another church. So oftentimes a lot of our burial sites are sometimes located in places that are sort of equidistant from those worship sites. That's certainly the case in our old Stewartsville Cemetery here in Laurinburg. People that came around 1790 are the nucleus, the earliest folks there. There were 3 Presbyterian congregations about equidistant from that place. It sort of became a common burial ground. The same could be said for the one that's known as the Old Scotch Cemetery, Old Scotch Graveyard in Moore County, sort of equidistant from a few others as well. And simply you had folks that may have been out there someplace and they're not going to a common burial ground. They're just, here's my land, I'm just putting somebody down. Then on top of that, the fact that many of these people, due to our lack of native stone, now we do have some very primitive native stone markers that can be found a few places. They have some very rude inscriptions on them. We have one marker here Stewartsville that we know was a veteran of Culloden.
Mm.
But you know, there's nothing telling that on this rude fieldstone marker there. You got other places in which, as opposed to stone markers, people would have used pine or cypress planks. And that's something that's not found in a lot of other areas outside of this area in which those two woods were very prominent and used. Heart pine and cypress will last a long time. And I've been on places such as within the Fort Bragg Reservation and other places where you'll come across this burial site in the middle of the pine woods, and there may be 50 wood markers, wood planks. Some of them being relatively just a stake or stub, others being sort of a patterned after a head and shoulders kind of design, very simple. We don't know who those people were. You know, I mean, we know the families that are there, but we don't know who those individuals were.
That's
In a
amazing.
situation such as the old Mount Carmel Presbyterian Church, which is where Flora and Alan worshipped, there's only one formed stone marker within that old cemetery there, and that's for a man called Hugh MacDonald of Armadale, and that was Flora MacDonald's stepfather. Pretty prominent member of the community. So he got a nice marker, but the rest of the people buried in that cemetery, they're just simply rough stones. They're not very far from the PD River. So they had some stones. Here's a stone. It must be 200 of them.
And no inscription on them at all.
No inscription or anything. Just a marker to mark where that person lies.
Wow.
So many stories could, you just wish you could go and find out who that was and where they came from and what their story was.
I know, it's like it's lost history. I just so much think we could,
But we know that those are we know they're Highland folk. Here's a congregation founded by a Skyeman, very popular man, and doubtless number of McDonalds and McLeods and McCaskills and McInneses and others buried in that cemetery. The same thing with those. They've been traditionally known as, like, there's one on Fort Bragg when there was the McLeod and McCrimmon Cemetery. You can't tell the planks who's there, but that's who's there.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I was just going to say when Claire and Roger and Bree were investigating and trying to find where Jamie was, they got really lucky with those records, didn't they?
You're lucky. Well, at least at that time.
Yeah.
That's right, because it's really hard to dig and find. Some of these records are just gone, like you said.
Yeah, people talk about records. I mean, I'm sorry, but William T. Sherman didn't visit every courthouse in North Carolina. He's not responsible for everything, but fire, obviously. Fire.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
So many things lost by fire. If we had complete records for Anson County and other neighboring counties, boy, we'd have a much fuller picture of this Highland settlement than we do. But there's still these little subliminal things off in the woods that tell us that they were there.
Yeah.
And we're thankful to have those. At least we have those things.
Absolutely. And sort of in retrospect here, when we think about immigrant populations here in North Carolina, and I know some of these were actually touched on within the Outlander series as well. We talked about the Ulster Scots, but let's think about the others. We had large numbers of, let's say, Anglo-English settlers that had spilled over into North Carolina from the Tidewater, Virginia area. We have Swiss immigrants that came in around, Swiss and German immigrants around Newbern, that area. Later, we had another Swiss group and some Welsh in the Cape Fear north of Wilmington. You got the German, the Moravian, that Eastern European and German population. Every last one of the immigrant populations that came to colonial North Carolina came from someplace else. the Welsh, the Ulster Scots, Pennsylvania, the Swiss, same thing. You know, all these other people had migrated here overland after coming from their mother country. They came to one place, then they came to North Carolina. The only immigrant group which came to North Carolina directly from the mother country in large numbers were Scots, particularly Highland Scots.
Mm-hmm. That just kind of gives me chills.
And we think about that.
I mean, seriously, it does.
Oh yeah, and we look in today's history books and things like that, and if you're lucky enough to find a mention of a Scots person,
Mm-hmm.
you know, this
I know.
population has been tremendously neglected.
Mm.
And that's why the Outlander series has done so much positive for not only things Scottish, but just for the history of North Carolina in general. It's really awakened people to that colonial history of North Carolina and its great diversity and depth and richness.
That's right.
And you can't talk about it. No educated person can talk about it without including the Scots.
Well, that is so true. And see, that's something, you know, being a native North Carolinian all of my life, being born and raised here, I had no idea until the Outlander books came along. I can credit my friend Carolyn with sharing those with me, and this is where all of this, you know, I tell people, you know, if it hadn't been for Carolyn, we wouldn't be sitting here today, Bill. You and I wouldn't. But, you know, I didn't know that history.
Really?
I was completely ignorant of that. And I think so many people now are learning through the Outlander phenomenon and the fan base, that they're learning so much more about the history. And that is a great thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, my grandmother was a teacher in the 1940s and 50s. I think she retired in the early 60s, but she had a textbook that I used to love to look at. A textbook in their house. I still have it someplace. It's somebody's History of North Carolina. There was a green bound book, and it must be about that thick. And it was great little pictures and stories. You had the stories of Manteo and Wanchese and the Lost Colony, all this. But the story of Flora MacDonald, the coming of the Highlanders, this is a man in a kilt. All that was part of that history, as well as everything else that really makes it rich.
Right.
And we don't have that today. But that's one of the things that sort of got me hooked.
Oh, cool.
Well, how do we get that back? I mean, how do we get that back into our into the schools, into the history books? How do we get that back?
That's an interesting question, because you know, now I'm concerned about the study of history, you know, as a historian. And I don't want to get, I'm not going to get on any soapboxes here, but how can you know where you're going if you don't know where you've been?
Mm-hmm.
And we have seen, particularly in the past year, with a lot of the turmoil that we've had here in our own state and our own nation, a lot of different interpretations or misinterpretations of history, which has caused a great deal of difficulty. And I'm not going to say that revisionism is completely wrong. Sure, everybody's story needs to be told. But we've been a marginalized people as well. And our story should be just as important as anyone else's.
That's right.
And when you look at the region that this settlement covered and the notable people that have come from it, the fact that this culture that we talked about, as we talked about earlier in this recording, it was not just a lily white thing. This is something that encompassed all of our cultures and was part of all of their stories. You know, when I find people, I knew a man man that came to do some work for me in my yard. He was an African American man. His name was Alistair Campbell.
Oh my gosh.
How many places would you find something like that? You know, and when I first came to Laurinburg, you could get your hair cut at Angus McInnes's barbershop downtown. We have our own state representative, state senator, House Representative Locke Faircloth. How many people they call him Locke? Well, his name came from a Locke study, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, these given names that we have. You know, when we see, you know, athletes with names, Highland names on their sports jerseys,
Yeah.
come around, and they're from different ethnicities. I've actually had some very interesting inquiries from people of those other ethnicities that are anxious to know about, you know, who are these people, you know, and so history is all inclusive. It's all inclusive. I don't think that it should marginalize anyone. I think the stories of people who made notable contributions, irregardless of what the past was, we can't look at the past through modern day lenses in all cases. We've got to look at it through the past day lenses in some degree and understand that these people were products of their time.
That's right.
They weren't bad people. They were religious, upright people that were products of their time, as were these Scots. And there's a great story to be told that includes everyone that I think anyone could appreciate, and that's just what I would like to see for the future. And hopefully the Outlander series and other things will continue to do that.
Yeah, and that's great. That's great.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great note to end it on, because we ended it on Outlander and history and how the two have kind of connected each other together with those of us who are the fans who had absolutely no idea about the history, and that we're learning this now. And Bill, you've been such a great the insight that you've given us has just been awesome, and we really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. I enjoy sharing it. It's something that I've grown up with and learned to appreciate, and I just enjoy sharing it with people. Maybe that's what I was sent here to do, is a providential mission, maybe.
That's right. And like I said, I could sit here and talk to you all day. You get tired of my questions. I'm the first person on a tour. When I go on a historical tour, my husband is always like holding me back because he knows I'm going to be the one to ask the questions. So I'm sorry. I apologize for all the interruptions and questions, but this is just fascinating to me. And thank you so much for sharing it with us. We really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure, Beth, Carolyn. I look forward to spending some more time with you all in the future, getting to meet some more of your Outlander fans and fan base there. It's a great thing. I look forward.
It is. And just tell people real quickly about the Scotland County Highland Games, because I know that's on go for this year.
We are on go. Scotland County Highland Games will be held on the 2nd of October here in Laurinburg. We will have our website updated very soon. We do have a Facebook group, Scotland County Highland Games. Feel free to check us out. Our website is Carolina-HighlandGames.com. That's all together, Carolina-HighlandGames altogether.com. Be updating that website very soon as we are moving forward with that. Certainly welcome you in our old Scottish community here to come enjoy a day. If you can't go to Scotland, you can certainly come to Scotland County.
That's right. That's as good as it gets.
Close enough. Only a generation or two apart. Yeah.
Well, Bill, once again, thank you so much. We appreciate everything, and it's been a great adventure, and we will be looking forward to getting back with you soon.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.